Galamsey, a term that echoes through the forests, rivers, and communities of Ghana. It's shorthand for illegal small-scale mining, an activity that has gripped our nation and plunged it into an environmental and social crisis. But what is Galamsey, and why is it so destructive? Galamsey is a term that allegedly comes from a simplified version of the phrase gather them and sell. The roots of Galamsey stretch back to Ghana's colonial period, when locals sought to benefit from the rich gold deposits in their communities. What started as small-scale, manual operations has now exploded into a chaotic and largely unregulated industry. Today, Galamsey is driven by poverty, unemployment, and the lure of quick wealth. But this is no longer just about survival. The cost of Galamsey is staggering. Ghana's rivers, once a source of life, are now choked with mud and toxic chemicals like mercury. Our forests are being decimated, agricultural lands rendered barren, and communities left in poverty despite the promise of gold. The health effects are equally dire. Mercury poisoning, arsenic contamination, and waterborne diseases are rising as Galamsey pollutes drinking water and farmland. Meanwhile, the social costs grow. Child labor, school dropouts, and teenage pregnancies are tearing at the fabric of rural communities. Successive governments have promised to tackle Galamsey. Policies have been drafted, task forces deployed, yet the menace persists. Why? Corruption, weak enforcement, and the sheer scale of the problem have undermined these efforts. Adding to the controversy is the legislative instrument, LI 2462, passed in 2022, which allowed mining in forest reserves under strict regulations. While intended to control mining activities, this legal framework has raised alarms as it opened the door for exploitation, further endangering some of Ghana's most critical ecosystems. Forest reserves, once protected sanctuaries, are now under threat from both legal and illegal operations. When we talk about Galamsey, it's easy to focus on the visible destruction, the ravaged landscapes and deforested lands. But some of the most devastating effects aren't immediately obvious. Ghana's rivers are being poisoned, and that poison is creeping into the water supply. Mercury, arsenic, and other toxins from illegal gold mining are contaminating the very water people depend on to live. The consequences of this are dire. Many rivers in Ghana, such as the Pra and Cobra, and often, have become toxic due to the rampant illegal mining activities. Mercury, a dangerous heavy metal used in the gold extraction process, is being dumped directly into these rivers. This poses a severe threat to local ecosystems and, more alarmingly, to the people who depend on these rivers for drinking water. Ghana's water sources have become so polluted that even the Ghana Water Company, the country's main supplier of treated water, is struggling to purify it. The high turbidity, or cloudiness, of the water makes it incredibly difficult to filter. The excessive sediment, chemical contaminants, and heavy metals from Galamsey mining operations make standard filtration processes ineffective. In some regions, the water is so polluted that the filtration systems can't keep up, leading to water shortages. The water that does make it through the process may still contain harmful levels of toxins, posing serious health risks to the population. Mercury poisoning is one of the most serious health risks associated with Galamsey. This heavy metal is highly toxic, especially in its organic form, known as methylmercury, which forms when mercury interacts with microorganisms in water. Methylmercury builds up in fish and other aquatic life, eventually finding its way into the bodies of people who consume them. When mercury enters the human body, it can have devastating effects. It primarily targets the nervous system, leading to symptoms such as tremors, memory loss, and cognitive dysfunction. Long-term exposure can cause irreversible damage to the brain, kidneys, and immune system. For pregnant women, mercury poisoning is particularly dangerous, as it can impair fetal development, leading to birth defects and developmental delays in children. Another less talked about danger in Galamsey mining is arsenic poisoning. Arsenic naturally occurs in gold deposits, and when miners disturb the earth to extract gold, they release arsenic into surrounding water and soil. Like mercury, arsenic is highly toxic and can cause a range of serious health problems. Arsenic poisoning can occur when people drink contaminated water or consume crops grown in arsenic-laden soil. It can also enter the body through the inhalation of dust near mining sites. The effects of arsenic poisoning are slow and often go unnoticed until the damage is severe. Chronic exposure to arsenic can lead to skin lesions, cancer, and damage to the lungs, liver, and kidneys. In fact, long-term arsenic exposure is linked to higher rates of bladder, lung, and skin cancers. Other symptoms include vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and, in severe cases, organ failure. In many parts of Ghana, access to clean drinking water is becoming a crisis. As rivers become too toxic to use, communities must rely on alternative sources, such as boreholes or even trucked-in water. However, these alternatives are not always available, and many Ghanaians continue to use contaminated water out of necessity. Galamsey may seem like just a local issue, restricted to the region where it happens, but the environmental cost of illegal mining stretches far beyond the mines themselves. It's a crisis that threatens not only the landscapes of Ghana but also its people's livelihoods, food security, and even its climate. Let's take a closer look at how Galamsey is ravaging the environment. One of the most visible and devastating impacts of Galamsey is deforestation. Ghana's rich forests, home to countless species and vital ecosystems, are being cleared at an alarming rate to make way for illegal mining sites. Large swathes of forest, including areas within Ghana's forest reserves, are stripped away, leaving the land barren and exposed. These forests serve as critical carbon sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When they are destroyed, that carbon is released back into the air, contributing to climate change. But the impacts don't stop with carbon emissions. Deforestation leads to soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and disrupted water cycles. Many of the areas targeted for illegal mining are farmlands. In regions where people once grew crops to feed their families and communities, the land is being dug up and poisoned. Galamsey destroys the topsoil, the fertile layer essential for growing food. Without this topsoil, farming becomes nearly impossible. Once fertile lands are turned into wastelands, forcing farmers off their lands and deepening poverty in rural areas. The loss of agricultural productivity not only impacts the livelihoods of local farmers but also threatens Ghana's food security as a whole. As more land is taken over by illegal mining, the ability to produce food decreases, pushing the country closer to food shortages. Galamsey leaves behind a toxic legacy. The mercury and chemicals used in the mining process not only contaminate water bodies but also poison the soil itself. This contamination lingers long after the mining stops, making the land unusable for agriculture or any other form of development. Mercury and arsenic seep into the soil, killing plants and making it impossible for new vegetation to grow. The result? Vast areas of poisoned land that can take decades, if not longer, to recover. In some cases, the damage is permanent and the land can never be used productively again. It's not just the land that's suffering. Ghana's rivers, once vital to local communities, are being choked by pollution. Mercury, silt, and other contaminants from illegal mining have turned once thriving rivers into dead zones. Fishermen who have relied on these rivers for generations are now struggling to catch fish, as the water has become too toxic for aquatic life to survive. Many species of fish are dying off due to the high levels of mercury and the heavy sedimentation from mining activities. The silt clouds the water, blocking sunlight and preventing aquatic plants from growing. Without these plants, fish populations collapse, taking with them the livelihoods of local fishermen. This has a cascading effect. As fish stocks dwindle, food security is threatened, and entire communities who depend on fishing are left without a source of income or sustenance. Ghana's rivers are its lifeblood. They provide water for drinking, irrigation, and industrial use. But Galamsey is slowly killing these vital waterways. As illegal mining continues to dump waste, rivers like the Pra and Cobra and often are becoming so polluted that they risk becoming dead rivers. Once a river becomes too toxic, its ecosystem collapses. Fish die, plants no longer grow, and the water becomes unusable for any human purpose. The long-term consequences of a dying river are catastrophic. Not only does it mean the loss of a critical water source, but it can also cause lasting damage to entire regions dependent on the river. Illegal mining contributes to another unseen disaster, flooding. With the removal of trees and vegetation, the land loses its ability to absorb water, leading to increased runoff and erosion. When heavy rains come, the bare land cannot hold the water, causing flash floods that devastate nearby communities. In some cases, these floods can lead to landslides, as the exposed soil is easily swept away by rain. This not only destroys homes and farms but also washes toxic mining chemicals downstream, spreading pollution even further. Deforestation and land degradation also disrupt rainfall patterns. Forests play a critical role in regulating the water cycle by absorbing moisture from the atmosphere and releasing it through a process called transpiration. When forests are removed, this balance is thrown off, leading to erratic rainfall, too little rain in some areas and too much in others. These changing rainfall patterns can cause droughts in some regions and flooding in others, further threatening food production and putting even more pressure on Ghana's already strained environment. Galamsey isn't just devastating to the land and water. It's also robbing Ghana's future by pulling children out of school, putting them into hazardous labor, and exposing young girls to increased risks of teenage pregnancy. The social toll of illegal mining is crippling entire communities and perpetuating a cycle of poverty and lost potential. One of the darkest consequences of Galamsey is the widespread use of child labor. Across Ghana's illegal mining regions, thousands of children are being pulled into the dangerous and grueling world of mining. Boys and girls, some as young as 8, are forced to work long hours in hazardous conditions, often exposed to harmful chemicals and extreme physical labor. Children are often seen as cheap labor. Miners exploit their small size, using them to climb into narrow shafts and tunnels where adults cannot fit. These conditions are not only exploitative but also extremely dangerous. Mining pits can collapse, and children frequently work without any safety equipment, putting them at constant risk of injury or even death. As more children are forced into mining, school dropout rates in Galamsey-affected areas are skyrocketing. Education, which is key to breaking the cycle of poverty, is being abandoned in favor of immediate earnings from mining. Families struggling to make ends meet often prioritize the income their children can bring in, even if it means sacrificing their education. Many of these children drop out of school entirely, losing their chance at an education and a better future. Without basic literacy and numeracy skills, their prospects for employment outside of mining are extremely limited. This creates a vicious cycle, as future generations will remain trapped in the same cycle of poverty, with few opportunities to escape. Communities near illegal mining operations have seen a significant rise in dropout rates, particularly in rural areas where schools are already under-resourced. This isn't just a crisis for these children, it's a crisis for the nation. Without education, Ghana's next generation is being left behind, weakening the country's human capital and future potential. Another tragic consequence of Galamsey is the rise in teenage pregnancy in mining areas. With the influx of miners into rural communities, often living in makeshift camps, there has been an increase in exploitative relationships between miners and young girls. Many teenage girls are lured into relationships with older miners who offer money or gifts in exchange for sex. For these young girls, the consequences are life-altering. Many end up pregnant, forced to drop out of school, and left to raise children without any support. This perpetuates a cycle of poverty, as teenage mothers often lack the resources or education to provide for themselves or their children. These young mothers face immense challenges. Without education, their options are limited, and they are often forced into low-paying, informal work, or worse, into mining themselves. Teenage pregnancy also increases the risk of maternal health complications, as these young girls are not physically or emotionally prepared for motherhood. The Galamsey industry preys on vulnerable populations, and children are often the easiest to exploit. In many cases, young boys and girls are trafficked or coerced into working for illegal mining operators. Their labor is often unpaid or grossly underpaid, leaving them trapped in dangerous working conditions without any protections or rights. These children are exposed to more than just the physical dangers of mining. They are also vulnerable to abuse, violence, and exploitation. The mining camps, often located far from their homes, lack any form of oversight, making it easy for adults to take advantage of young workers. Many children face threats or physical abuse if they try to leave or complain about the conditions. The consequences of child labor, school dropouts, and teenage pregnancy extend far beyond the individuals directly affected. When children leave school to work in mines or become young mothers, they miss out on the education and opportunities that could lift them and their families out of poverty. This weakens not only the economic prospects of individual communities but also Ghana's long-term economic development. Child labor perpetuates cycles of poverty, trapping entire generations in a system where education and opportunity are replaced by backbreaking labor and exploitation. The country loses out on the talent and potential of these young people, leading to a workforce that is less skilled, less educated, and less capable of driving innovation and growth.